So now that we've gotten audio into the DAW, in this video we're going to talk about how to edit the audio now that it's there. We're going to cover some basic editing operations, and I also want to take a moment to look at the historical context of how editing was done before the days of DAWs, when we might have had to do it with various analog media. So we're going to cover a few basic editing operations here: moving audio, copying and pasting it, changing or extending its duration, and splitting and gluing items so that we can kind of splice them and rearrange them in different ways. So I'm going to go straight over to Reaper here. I took the liberty of starting a 4-track project here with 4 clips from the EarSketch sound library. It's basically a drum, a bass, a lead, and this noise effects kind of thing. I'll just play that for you so you hear what it sounds like. Okay, and I have this running in a loop here, but I went ahead and stopped that right now. So what I'd like to do as we're editing this is basically turn this into an 8-measure kind of build-up, where it starts with just the drums coming in at measure 1, and then the bass comes in at measure 3, and then the lead comes in at measure 5, and then this white noise effects thing comes in at measure 7. So the first thing I'm going to do is just change my horizontal zoom level a little bit so I can actually see all 8 measures on one screen without having to scroll. And so if I just click one of these things, I can drag it around and move it wherever I want. So I can move track 2 to start on measure 3, and this one to start on measure 5, on track 4 to start on measure 7, like that. That doesn't exactly do what I wanted yet, because I want this to last a full 8 measures, and each one to come in and add to what's already there. So I can go and I can copy this just with Control or Apple C, like I would in a word processor or anywhere else, with the cursor where I want it to show up, and do paste. And I can do it like that. And that works. It's a little bit tedious, though, especially if I want something that's going to repeat a bunch of times, not just for 8 measures, but maybe for 50 measures. And so there's another way to do this as well, which is that if I move my cursor to the very end of an audio item, you can see how it changes into this double arrow here. And then I can simply drag and make it last as long as I want. And what it does then is it doesn't actually stretch, do any changing to the playback speed. It simply loops that file as many times as is necessary to fill up the required space. So I can go ahead and do that for this as well, and for this as well. And that gives me exactly what I wanted to create. We can listen to this again. And loop back to the beginning there. But one other thing that I might want to do, and just to illustrate this, I'm going to go ahead and solo track 2 here, and show you what I mean. I'm going to go back here, and if we start playback at measure 3 here, you'll notice it plays one note for one measure, and then another note for another measure. So what if I only wanted it to play one of those notes instead of 2? Well, this whole item is kind of one entity here. So I can drag it together and copy and paste it together, but there's no obvious way to select just that second measure. So what I can do is I can position my play cursor at the beginning of measure 4 here, so right at that point where the note changes. I can go to the item menu, and I can say split items at cursor. If I do that, you can see now I have 2 separate items, and I can drag them around separately and do whatever I want with them. So let's say that I just, for some reason, only wanted the second half of this. So I'm going to delete that first one. I just select it with my mouse, and I hit the delete button. It's gone. I'm going to have this one start at the beginning of measure 3. And then I really want this to be a kind of 2-measure unit, since all these other clips were a 2-measure unit that I can drag around and work with as its own entity. So I'm going to copy this. I'll click on measure 4. I'm going to paste it at the beginning of measure 4. So now I have 2 of these together. If I shift-click to click on both of them, well, now I can go back to that item menu, and I can say glue items back together. When I do that, they once again become a single entity. which I can kind of move as one entity, and I can extend the duration of just like I did with the other tracks. So now if we listen to this, I'll play this in isolation on solo for a second, and then I'll play you the whole thing again. You get the picture. So splitting and gluing can be very useful things. If I need to get down at a hierarchical level that's lower than one of these individual items, that might, because items might be 1 measure long, they might be a beat long, they might be 32 measures long. It just depends on the size of the audio file that I imported or the length of the recording that I made. So here's the final version of what we've created here. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn off solo here. There we go. And in this case, you might argue that I actually made it worse by doing this edit to the bass and removing the second note, but I wanted to do it just to demonstrate to you how you could do those kinds of edits. So those are the basic editing operations I wanted to cover, but it's important that we understand kind of where some of these things came from. And so I want to talk about editing in some analog media for a second, and some of those operations that we just did, and how we would do them with records and with tape. So I want to look at 2 examples to illustrate this. And the first is that extending the duration of a clip by looping, where we went to the very end of the clip and it became the double arrow, and we dragged it out to loop for a particular length of time. Well, how would we do that if our media was a record? It's not immediately clear how we might do that. If you're a very talented DJ, you might be able to move the needle and jump it back and forth to loop and so on. But even that, with a single turntable at least, would be extremely difficult because you have to actually pick up the needle and put it back, and that's not going to happen instantaneously. So in the early days of electronic music, and by early I mean the late 1940s and early 1950s, what people were doing to do this was a very different kind of technique. So I want to walk you through this. The person I want to talk about is Pierre Schaeffer, who's one of the kind of seminal figures of early electronic music. And his piece Étude à chemin de fer from 1948 is considered by some to be the first piece of electronic music ever written. He was working at a radio station in Paris with this notion of musique concrète, that you should go out in the real world, you should record real sounds, and then you should edit those together and manipulate them in order to create a piece of music. And this was the first piece he created in this vein with sounds of trains. And so what he had to do to make this work, because he was working with records, and he wanted to be able to loop, to repeat some particular train sounds over and over and over again. So you can imagine how a record normally works, is that it's a spiral like this. The grooves kind of go in a spiral. So the needle starts at the outside here, and then kind of works its way inside until it gets to the very end. He used a special kind of record called a lock groove record. And a lock groove record, instead of being a spiral, is a series of concentric circles. So you end up with one circle there, and one circle there, and one circle there, one circle there, and on and on and on. And so with a lock groove record, what you can do is you can go ahead and record onto just one of these concentric circles, like say that one. And then when you put the needle on to play, it's just going to go around and around over and over and over again. It's never going to get to any of the other circles. And so that's effectively going to play a loop for you. So if you do that and then you record this kind of looping around over and over and over again onto a regular record, well then you've effectively extended the duration of a clip to make it work that way. This is obviously a really painful thing to do, but I wanted to give you some perspective of how this worked in 1948. And now go ahead and listen to a recording of this piece and listen for those repetitions and keep this technique in mind as you're listening to it. Also keep in mind that this was written in 1948, and so your expectations about production quality and kind of what could be done in manipulating sounds should be set accordingly. The second example I wanted to cover was with reel-to-reel tape. And we did the split and glue operation in Reaper, where we split apart an audio file basically into two separate sections, and we manipulated them separately. And then when we had some composite of different sections, we then glued it back together to form something that was conceptually like a new item. To do this with magnetic reel-to-reel tape, as was done through the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s and 80s, was a very different kind of process that involved taking a razor blade and literally cutting the tape to make that split, and then using some sticky tape to attach two different pieces of tape back together. There's a video that documents this process in almost painful detail that I'd like you to at least watch a little bit of a part of, so you get a sense of what was involved in doing this in the realm of magnetic tape. So to review quickly, what we've covered in this video are these basic editing operations in the DAW in terms of working with audio, and essentially how much harder it was to do these things that seem very simple now in the old days of analog media like records and tapes. In the next several videos, we're going to now approach the topic of effects and how to add effects to tracks, and then how particular effects work and how to use them.